This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari and Around 6 to 7 million years ago, a furry ape species roamed the African forest habitat. But the species was soon to diverge into two branches. The branch that stayed in the forest became chimpanzees and bonobos. Another branch ventured out to the savanna. They became humans. So what happened on that savanna? For a long time, hunting has been regarded as the key to this puzzle. Hunting required humans to walk on two legs, collaborate efficiently, and lose the thick fur to cool down better. Big brains were favored by hunting tactics and fueled by cooked meat. And the formation of romantic bonds allowed females and their young ones to secure meat from this mainly male activity. Kristen Hawkes thinks that this story misses something important, something happening to the female side of our species. Hawkes is an evolutionary anthropologist whose work highlights a further peculiarity about humans, our longevity. We live long, much longer than any of our relatives, and we did so even before modern medicine. And most strikingly, human females live a large part of their adult life without being able to produce new offspring. This looks like a serious puzzle. Indeed, menopause is a true biological oddity, typical only to humans and some species of whales. Hawkes has a theory to explain this puzzle. It's called the grandmother hypothesis. And remarkably, it emerged from meticulous studies that Hawkes and her colleagues did in cooperation with the Hadza people, a group of hunter-gatherers who still live on wild savanna foods. This episode explores two sides of the grandmother hypothesis. First, why would humans have evolved to survive the menopause? And second, why is this a big deal? What were the cascading changes that surviving the menopause arguably triggered? Before proceeding to the episode, I do want to put a disclaimer here. For we talk in this episode a fair bit about pair bonding, long-lasting romantic relationships, and this is an area where misunderstanding can cause real harm to people's lives, so I want to be extra careful. Yet our discussion might sound overly cynical to some, as if romantic love would be just a sham, a tactic adopted by so-called lovers who actually just want their genes to the next generation. This would be a troubling conclusion, but is certainly not the intended one, and if anybody wonders why, I urge them to spend a moment reflecting on adoptive parenting or homosexual love, or the fact that most countries need to pay males to donate to sperm banks. The potential confusion emerges, I believe, because of the common but misleading way in which many, including myself, use psychological metaphors to dumb down evolutionary dynamics. Instead of talking about boring terms like mutation and selection, we talk about a male wanting this or a female wanting that, or a selfish gene wanting to spread itself. So please take such claims with a pinch of salt. Indeed, I really hope that no listener will leave this episode thinking that evolution has proven that genuine love does not exist. Evolution does no such things. It simply explains why the first lovers were not removed from the gene pool. If you're interested in this distinction, you might enjoy my short article on the topic titled Distorting Darwinism. You will find a link to it in the show notes. There you will also find a full list of technical terms and names mentioned in this conversation. I hope you enjoy this excursion to the deep history of our species. I bring to you Kristen Hawkes. Professor Kristen Hawkes, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, you're well known for your work around the grandmother hypothesis, which relates to tons of topics within human evolution. But before we get into those topics, what is the grandmother hypothesis?
Well, of course, I'm delighted to be asked, but one of the first things I'd have to say is that there are many versions of the grandmother hypothesis, and the one, there are many others around. So the one that I will privilege is the one that we've come to think really needs to be on the table and lays out these particular things that we ought to want to explain. And one of them is the prevalence in human populations wherever we know anything about persistent populations. It is the case that a large fraction of the living population and about a third of the adult females are past their fertile years. Now, that should be a serious biological puzzle. So here I am, a postmenopausal woman, more or less able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And yet I am one of multitudes. How in the world can selection have favored this postmenopausal life stage. And when we compare ourselves to the other living hominids, and let's use chimpanzees, the end of fertility is about the same. Chimpanzee females, if they are lucky enough to live into their late 40s, and usually they're not, even in captivity, keeping a female chimpanzee alive to 45 is very rare. They get old and die before that. Jane Goodall talked about chimpanzees becoming aged by 33, and yet in human populations, women persist. Their mortality is much lower through their childbearing years. And if they do live to the end of them, then they're likely to live another couple of decades or more. And so if we say, well, let's assume this is a product of evolution, how can selection have favored that? And one of our first papers coming out of this a behavioral ecology project in northern Tanzania, a place where Hadza folks were living on wild foods in the kind of ecology that's one of the best living representatives of the context in which our genus evolved. And there we were seeing the hard work of these old ladies. And I had been thinking that what the reason we evolved was because of men hunting to provision their mates and offspring. And a whole bunch of things followed from that. The dominant idea in the textbooks remains the hunting hypothesis. I assumed we already knew that. And actually, it had been a previous research project that had led me to question, wait a minute. So this was not in East Africa. It was in South America, in Eastern Paraguay, a chance to actually watch people who were living on wild foods. And it's an unusual opportunity. But anyway, which I can say more about or not, but anyway, it allowed us to collect a lot of quantitative data on what resources individuals were choosing and whose stomachs it was going into. And there were these quantitative data showing that the men were doing things that mostly went to everybody else, not to their own mates and offspring, and that their mates and their mates' kids got most of the meat from the hunting of other guys. So wait a minute. What are these males doing? And that had been part of the reason for joining Nick Blurton-Jones, who was setting up this Hadza project. And he invited me and Jim O'Connell, who's an archaeologist, to join him to collect these data, spending time where people were so generous, allowing us to follow them around and weigh what they got and time how long it took and, see how far they walked and do all those things. And we saw that the men were specializing in the really big animals, and that if they actually did take a small animal, then they would just eat it on the spot and carry on trying to get a big one. When they did, whoa, that's the people's meat. Everybody would come, everybody would claim a share. So we were paying a lot of attention to that, and at the same time logging all these data on what I was spending a lot of time watching these old ladies in the hot sun, digging these deeply buried tubers, just so productive. And it took, it's amazing in retrospect how long it took me in particular to see what I was seeing, to really realize what this was an example of. But we were actually weighing people, and we were watching the importance of a woman's productivity as a forager, because we were weighing people on the weight gains of her children until she had a new baby. And then the correlation went away, and the correlation was with the foraging productivity of grandmothers. And we could then see, good heavens, look at that. if that post-fertile stage is actually spent subsidizing the fertility of still fertile females, then that would make sense.
So let's make sure that we understand all the pieces here. So you see, studying these Hadza hunter gatherers, that the mothers are those who really predict how much food the kids will get. So the dads are hunting, but when they get game, it's shared with everyone. And so whether your dad is a great hunter or a lousy hunter doesn't really make a big difference.
Exactly.
What makes a difference is whether your mother is a good forager or not a good forager, because women forage these low risk products that you get every day, roughly the same amount, so you don't need to share them that much. However, it is when the mother has their next child that it's no more whether your mother is a good forager or not, it's whether your grandmother is a good forager or not.
Yes. I was about to take advantage of this point about our seeing in the weights that this dependence on grandmother's productivity allowed mothers to have their next babies sooner, because the kids who were still they're still little kids, they still can't feed themselves, and this is where a connection with the other apes is crucial. If we look at what's going on in the other great apes, again, data are available on all of them, best on chimpanzees. A chimpanzee infant starts to feed itself while it's being carried along by its nursing mother. I mean, it's still drinking her milk, but it's also starting to pick the things that she's eating. And when it's weaned, it's an autonomous feeder. It can get its own lunch. But now look at us. And we look at these little Hansa kids, and they are trying to dig these deeply buried tubers that the old ladies are so amazing at, but they're just too small and too weak to be very effective at it. And so the hint about the kind of food that's being exploited by this population and the difference between it and what other apes are eating, which is soft fruits and leaves and things like that, going for these resources, which can give high returns if you're big enough and strong enough. But if you are too little, you cannot manage unless somebody subsidizes you. So we have these much shorter birth intervals. We produce babies at a much faster rate. And if you're a mom, you move on to the next one. Well, this one, the previous one is still completely, incompetent. And yet you go ahead and have the next one. And so we have an array of pieces that highlight uh, I mean, there's lots of differences between us and the other hominids, but highlight what are likely to be hugely important shifts in the evolution of our lineage. And it, in a sense, can be pinned on the productivity of these old ladies. You couldn't commit to those habitats. If you're a mom, you couldn't commit to those habitats unless, well, the kind of subsidy that isn't mother's milk that could be provided by someone else, then that's a situation in which the economic productivity of older females whose fertility is declining could then subsidize the fertility of the younger females and allow them to have babies faster. And the females who were aging more slowly could subsidize more, have more descendants, and that slower aging would spread in descendant populations.
And that is the grandmother hypothesis.
Right.
Well, the logic here being that evolutionarily it doesn't seem to make sense to have a creature that is not even producing offspring. However, that doesn't take into account the fact that it's not only that we need to produce offspring, it's also that we need to care for the offspring.
That's right. And one of the consequences is that mothers can actually spend less on each kid because there's a subsidy. So they can have more of them. And so the whole life history shifts, and we have all these folks with zero reproductive value, and yet the population's got gazillions of them. How could that be explained? And that's what the grandmother hypothesis is about. It can explain that. And then there is much more to say about consequences of that for a whole array of other things about us.
Just to take stock here, basically it starts from the puzzle of postmenopausal females. How can it be that evolution has favored so many um, non-reproducing females to be in the population? This is not a problem for males because males, if I've understood correctly, stay fertile for so much longer that this is not really a puzzle.
Right. But now, when this is a huge relevant part of the story, because let's assume that this is what's happening in ancestral populations. We get longevity increases. So we get more and more post fertile females. And we then get more and more old males, but they're still fertile. And of course, the only way they can get paternities is on the younger females. And this is a big difference between us and actually other primates in general. But it's, clearest maybe among chimpanzees where it's so well reported, where the adult males prefer the old females as copulation partners. And the young boys who are trying to make their way in the male hierarchy, they end up getting some paternities because of copulations with the young females who were having their first ovulations. And, they're trying to attract the older males, and the older males, oh, leave me alone. But the younger ones are right in there. And it does turn out they get some paternities that way. Well, again, I'm sure it won't be a surprise to your listeners that in this age, males generally prefer younger females as copulation partners.
And this
So
was the case also in the Hadza that you study, not just in post-industrial Western society.
yes, I mean, again, maybe this is too much of a soundbite, but the guys who are better hunters are more likely when their wife's fertility ends to get a younger wife and have kids with her. And so again, Nick's data show this pattern that the guys who are better hunters, they end up having more offspring, not because their kids survive better, but
Because the meat is shared.
yeah, because they end up having more kids.
So I guess it's then fair to say that the fact that we humans have this long postmenopausal period, it creates social dilemmas and troubles in romantic relationships. However, it does also give this wonderful opportunity to have hardworking grandmothers who are supporting younger women, their daughters, in caring for their children, and that allows humans to have this really unique situation where we have very vulnerable kids, and nevertheless we can produce them at quite a speed in comparison to many other primates. Is that correct?
That is. And, we already kind of stepped over into this pair bonding question because that really distinguishes us. But when we get this life history shift to the increased longevity and, all these old females, there also are all these old males who are competing with the younger males. And that competition is really substantial and across the sexual reproducing world. I mean, this starts off with Jeff Parker studying dung flies in cases when there are more competitors, but this is a male perspective, more competitors for those paternities. Often your best strategy is to guard the one you've got. I mean, stepping out to climb into the competition when it's stiff is not the best choice. And that is then a segue into a thing that distinguishes us from our closest living relatives, these pair bonds, this mate guarding, where the claim of a male on that female is one that others defer to.
And how would that work from the female perspective? How would you start thinking about the reason that females form strong pair bonds in humans, but not other great apes? Why do we have this tendency, even in, for example, in the huts and, for example, in modern societies, to form these strong pair bonds?
One possibility, this is actually a suggestion that Nick made in a paper looking at the patterns of pair bond stability across foragers. And the suggestion that he made was an advantage to a female of having a guard could well be that it slows down the harassment. And actually, that argument has been made long before by other people. The quote, hired done argument of Richard Wrangham's, which has been used in ways where I think he's really got it wrong. But the idea that I should remember who found these data looking at Canadian women, and the unmarried women were much more at risk for various things than the women who were married. And and Nick's suggestion was, if your economic productivity is so important, then being interrupted all the time to be hassled by males is an interference you'd do better not to have. And so if there is a guard who's making a claim on you, it may be very much in your interest to hey, leave me alone.
And so the suggestion would be that that in humans, the our strong romantic pair bonds evolved for two pressures. On the male side, the pressure was the, well, there's a lot of competition, so if I get a mate, I would really want to stick with the mate. And from the female point of view, well, these guys are harassing me all the time, and if I just find one mate who's happy with me and will protect me, that's a good good way to go. I guess it might be worth mentioning here that obviously this doesn't imply the cynical conclusion that this is what we actually today always do when we are in pair bonds. This is a story about the evolutionary pressures towards it, not what actually happens in our minds today. But I do want to talk a bit more about pair bonds because leaving the postmenopausal woman aside, uh,
As one does, leaving the
yes,
postmenopausal.
yes, yes. Yes, yes, yes. Um, Actually, I would love to talk about that later about the social implications of this. But yeah. So if we bracket that issue for a while and we just look at the question of uh, how is it that we can have this really rapid birth interval in humans, we can produce a lot of kids even if they're really helpless. Well, one of the natural places to look is fathers. Is to say that, well, maybe that's why we are such a unique great ape in having these really strong pair bonds, is because we have such vulnerable children. And so it really pays off for both parents to really invest heavily in the care for those children. And that's a natural place for the dads to be. And that would also explain this tendency of forming pair bonds. So, what do you think? Is this a good competitor? Is this a complementary point? Or how do you look at the role of fathers in thinking through this topic?
I think it's a competitor that's been winning for more than decades. It was actually Sherwood Washburn who laid this out the most clearly in the middle of the 20th century about um, nuclear families as units of common interest. And because dad went off to bring home the bacon, to feed mates, to feed wife and offspring. And that's the thing that made us human. And he connected that to everything, including our bipedality, our tool use, all kinds of things went along with the hunting hypothesis. And it was all predicated on that argument that that paternal effort produced, well, I can fill it in a little more, but if you have these, these things that started in the Miocene with these climate swings, and the receding forests and the savannas. And these are opportunities in which certain kinds of ungulates really thrive, really do well. And the hunting hypothesis is that was an opportunity to be hunters. But if you're a female and you got this little one, then that kind of gets in the way of being an effective hunter. And you'll do better to pair with a hunting mate who will then bring home the bacon and support you and the kids. And we get the sexual division of labor and, everything
Yeah,
else.
and that sounds at least theoretically, that sounds very convincing.
Yeah, I think it's easy to see why it has been so convincing. It was extremely comprehensive and seemed to account for so many things. I mean, part of it started to fall apart with the mysterious Australopithecines, where the story had really been that that hunting was what led to big brains because the smarter you are, the better hunter you'll be. And the combination of being bipedal, having free hands, being smarter, being a tool user, all those things went together and drove the story of why we differ from our closest living relatives. And some of that started to be challenged with the evidence that bipedality long antedated the big brains and a whole array of other. Well, there was also in Washburn's version what he called the obstetrical dilemma, that the increasingly larger brains made birth a lot trickier. And that meant you had to give birth earlier. And that made kids much more vulnerable. And I mean, you filled in some of those pieces already. So it's so easy to see why that seems so persuasive. And as I said to you, when I was first, so I didn't start out as an evolutionary biologist or with a particular interest in foragers. And as I was becoming an evolutionary biologist and learning some of these tools, I thought we knew that was the story of us, that it was the hunting hypothesis, and it was only trying to take advantage of some of these tools to understand how living on wild food actually works. Imagine you can't go to the garden and you don't have chickens in the backyard and no cows to milk, and how the hell do you feed children? And anyway, the opportunity to see how that's done, that then ended up with these data saying, wait a minute, these guys are not making the choice that will give the most to their mates and offspring. It's the opposite. They're choosing the things that go mostly to everybody else and that are so unpredictable that they are, when there's a bonanza, woohoo, everybody's excited, big deal. And that version, the hunting hypothesis, it's still the textbook story. You asked if it was a competitor. As I said, I think it's the competition that has continued to be there and continues apparently to be winning. People,
So
it's
that's the
still,
Goliath, and you're the David.
well, well, I don't know. Yeah, tell me, what is the stone? I wish I knew. I how in my view, the evidence against that is just increases all the time. And
And so
the lo
basically, the core evidence is the point that you made earlier, that the men, they're not useless in any sense. They're hunting very important calories, but they're hunting calories that are shared not only amongst the band but neighboring bands joining in the feast also. Um,
and if you're living in an environment where the little ones can't feed themselves, the fact that that you fail most of the time. I mean, this was amazing coming out of our Hadza data, that the average hunter fails more than 5% of the days. Statistically, you
you
never
mean
hit.
they succeed less than only would that would be like once a month on
Yeah,
average?
yeah. So here you have hungry children. Dad goes off to hunt, and the chances of him getting anything are, you know, to a statistical approximation, zero. That is not a way to feed the hungry children.
And that's why you need grandmothers.
The problem is it's got to be a daily, reliable source. Otherwise, the whole thing collapses. And so that comes back to the boring tuber digging of grandmothers, the daily, oh no, it's much more exciting to think about hunting and going after that, etc. You know?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would like to ask one more question about fathers. What's your own impression, anecdotally or scientifically, on the role of fathers in forming in attachment? Like we've talked about calories so far. What about the softer side of parenting in the Hadza community, for example? What was the role of fathers or grandfathers in the family life more generally, beyond just producing calories?
Well, from my perspective, grandfathers and grandmothers they're whole different stories. But no question, I know all these Hadza guys who have very warm relationships with their kids. So it's not the absence of affection and those things are visible. But let me. I'm. How exactly did you ask that question?
Yeah, I guess the question is about whether the fathers nevertheless have an important role, or grandfathers have an important role in the child care, if not by producing more calories than the neighbor, then in the more softer side of parenting, in
Well,
attachment, in love, in care.
yeah, I mean, so you may be thinking of these data from socioecologies like ours of the absent father consequences, but things that are so distinctive of the socioecology that probably most of the people of my neighborhood, probably of yours, most of the people that you talk to, probably most of the people who are likely to listen to this, our socioecology is not as face to face as characterizes foraging kinds of communities that depend on wild foods. And the thing that is aspirational, and it's really only aspirational, but it's a strong, I don't know, a strong aspiration that ideally you want a nuclear family that has a home and the kids are there and everybody eats dinner together and dad pays the rent and mom takes care of everything else. Anyway, that sort of 50s vision of how nuclear families work. It's present or absent a little bit in even in neighborhoods like the one I live in. But the thing that's characteristic of the societies that are the face-to-face kind. Remember, if you're spending time in these places, the notion that I want some privacy, will you just leave me alone, is just not a thing. And under those circumstances, where everybody is in each other's pockets all the time, where privacy is just not even a notion, if you're a little crosswise with mom or dad or, somebody else, there are all these other males, females, cousins, other individuals that you have relationships with. And in the same way for the 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 pair bond, that it's the only adult that I'm, sort of intimate with. No, there are all these other people who are right there and who you spend all kinds of time with. You talk about all kinds of things. So the weight that's put on any particular relationship is so much reduced. And the difficulty in societies like ours, the pressure that's put on pair bonds is just, I mean, it's amazing that they last as long as they often do.
I think we should start wrapping up soon, but before we do, I want to ask: is there something about the implications of the grandmother hypothesis that you would like to discuss before the end? We've already talked about how that, well, first of all, gives rise to the grandmothering class, which is this post-fertile females. We've talked about how it allows very rapid birth intervals. Are there any other characteristics of this ape, as you say, of us humans, that is explained by the grandmother hypothesis, if correct, and that you would like to highlight before we end?
There's another side to this, which is the brain side, which I have a lot to say about. I have fallen into this work of Barbara Finlay and her colleagues, which has just astonished me. This thing that characterizes the variation across the mammals, this brain size variation, and the thing that accounts for that brain size variation across the mammals is the duration of development. Now we're talking about the proximates, all those developmental events in making a mammal brain, and the longer it takes, the bigger it is. The thing that finishes last is the biggest. So the bigger the brain, the larger the fraction that's neocortex. And all of this is run by longevity. So we have an implication that completely reverses the causal arrow that we like to tell about our wonderful big brains. They make us so smart, and they have guided human evolution and made us the crowns of creation and whatever else. The lines of evidence that there they are for everyone to look at, are really consistent with the explanatory role of longevity in resulting in both the size of our brain and the large fraction that's neocortex.
So our special brain not being the cause of something so interesting in this story, but rather almost like a byproduct of longevity, which was selected for in order to be able to care for the little ones,
That's right.
i.e. the grandmothers.
The grandmothering subsidies, which made longevity favored by selection, also had this consequence for the way in which our brains develop more slowly and therefore are bigger, and the array of things that go with them. And since maybe it was before you started recording, but we talked about Sarah Hrdy and her incredible work on so many things earlier. And she has made this really important point that I want to link with what the brain story tells. And she has really highlighted how we tend to characterize human babies as altricial. They're just babies. They can't do anything, right? They're
Very helpless in the common English.
they are helpless. But as she has argued, they are socially precocious, that babies are cluing in to what's going on around them and wanting to attract attention and commitment. And these two things going on at once, the slower brain development to larger size going on at the same time that weaning age is earlier. And so the survival challenges to ancestral babies are absolutely astonishing. Nothing like the survival challenges to chimpanzee babies who just, mom's going to cover it. I don't have to do anything. I mean, it is not the case that, it's all about having fur and so on, because actually chimpanzee babies have to be held initially by their mothers. But it is the case that this complete dependence of human babies on support from somewhere, on mom, and yet she's got other stuff going on. Oh, see, I'm not so cute, and so this array of features about us that is associated with our social appetites, wanting to connect with is this somebody I want to be paying attention to me? And if so, what are they going to do next? And can I predict that? And wouldn't you like to pay attention to me? And this social appetite that then actually carries throughout life, it's just an overwhelming appetite. And that, according again to all the pieces that I've been trying to lay out, it is a powerful hypothesis that that's a consequence of taking the opportunity of these savanna habitats to exploit these resources that give high returns to adults, but not ship anyway. All those pieces, um, they connect a lot.
Before we end, I would like to ask one, I think, quite a challenging question. I'm sure that there is no well-known right answer to this, but what's your best guess on the origins of this human uniqueness? So it's one thing to say that humans are pretty unique because we have these postmenopausal females, and that has a whole lot of consequences. But there's always this problem when there is something really good in evolution, say the wings, you end up having convergent evolution. So all sorts of creatures develop the wings. Now, if this is such a good idea to have these grandmothers around, why don't we see them in all in birds, in mammals, in insects, everywhere? What was it that makes this unique thing, or somewhat unique thing, uniquely human? What was it about human evolution, do you think, about the human story that made this possible, and why don't we see it everywhere else if it's such a good idea?
It's hard for me to give a short answer to that. I think to the extent you buy into using natural selection as a way to think about that glorious diversity of the living world, there are a bunch of things that inevitably come to be important, and that's what has happened in phylogeny. What's the ancestral condition that then constrained where selection could go.
Exactly, yeah. So what is it about the human story? What is it that made us different from the bonobos, from the chimpanzees, from all the other primates, tweaking our path towards this unique path of grandmothers?
So the story I am telling is about the climate change that opened these savannas and restricted the forests. Now, as long as you stayed in the forest, you could continue to be a chimpanzee or a gorilla, or if you were in Asia, a orangutan, as long as the resources that you were exploiting were the ones that the little the ones you were still nursing, they could feed themselves on. And maybe you could even be on the fringes and still duck back into the forest, and lots of reasons to, as long as that's working, to keep doing that. But we know these climate swings meant the spreading savanna didn't make the forest opportunity go away, but it opened an opportunity that could be exploited. One of the things that we're learning about chimpanzees, um, across the African continent, there are chimpanzee populations. And the more we know about them, the more variable they are in all these interesting ways. But if I just stick to the Eastern ones for a minute and say females compete with each other, because, again, these soft fruits and leaves and so on, if there's another female trying to use those, then you don't get as much. And so females tend to have ranges that they stick to. If you are exploiting these extracted resources like the tubers I'm talking about, that competition thing goes away entirely. You actually do better to have somebody digging right next to you, because it helps open the area where you start to uncover the tubers. And so the competition side is gone. You actually have this mutualistic benefit from foraging with other females.
Fascinating.
But I mean, you start to dig and you don't get much, and then you start to open that tuber, and then and so what's happening is you are getting a higher return rate up to a point until you dug a few, and then you have this pile of things. And this is the opportunity then for all those other around to be in on it too. And the appropriators, those little ones who cannot feed themselves, whoa, here's a chance. But the older females who are still doing it, they're not adding more stomachs, not adding more grabbing hands, but they are adding more stuff to be grabbed. And that sets up um, selection to favor all the things that we've been talking about.
Fascinating. So I've heard this argument about the move from the forest to savanna being the origin of everything that's different between us and chimpanzees and bonobos. But this is a new story that I haven't heard before. So what you're saying is that the kind of foraging in the forest leads into female competition between females, female to female competition of this is my patch of stuff that I'm foraging. But on the savannah, it leads into a more teamwork style. Let's dig this root up together. And can you just before we end draw the link? What is the link between this mutualistic team play on the one hand, and then the grandmothers coming in and subsidizing the kids on the other hand?
Directly, that if what's going on is I actually do better to do this next to some other females, so we're all doing this together. We have our kids with us, and the ways in which we're doing this exploitation, we do it in batches because we get higher returns by doing it in batches. And now I'm ignoring the cooking side, which is especially interesting, and I'd be happy to talk about that. But let's just say, because that just amplifies this point that if you are cooking, then even more do we do better to be using the same cooking fire and so on. But the consequence of doing that then is that we are, in a sense, we're creating a resource that is an opportunity for appropriators to come in, and it is the cost of refusing that is higher than the benefit of allowing that, which is what I would say about what goes on with the sharing of big animals. And that the same thing is happening with this kind of resource, which is there daily as a thing. And the consequence is that those who are adding to the piles increase what's there. It's being reduced by all the consumers. But if the females who are now nearing the end of their fertility, they're the ones who ended up producing more descendants. And that meant in subsequent generations, longevity was increasing, and this cascade of effects, as the longevity increased, waiting longer to mature to have first babies is favored, and the array of things that we started with.
Great. Well, Professor Kristen Hawkes, it's been an amazing pleasure and an honor to speak with you. Before we end, final question. What kind of animals are we?
We are capable of the most amazing, wonderful kinds of generosity that are really stupefying. And we see it, with what's going on in Ukraine, horrible things. And then people taking in refugees in the most generous way. The other side, of course, is absolutely horrible, stupefying on both sides. As people uncover what was going on with the treatment of slaves in the US or the treatment of colonized people in East Africa, what's been coming out with the British treatment of the Mau Mau rebels. It's unbelievable torture. Just trying to imagine how people could do that to each other. And yet there's the evidence. They did. It's, yes, we are capable of absolutely amazingly wonderful things and horrible, unspeakable cruelties that are, as is it George Williams who said Mother Nature is known for some very nasty habits, or maybe he was quoted somewhere. There are, of course, examples in other animals of terrible things, but the extremes are astonishing. And so I don't know what. So where do we go with that? And when there are historical accounts, then the richness that can provide is wonderful. But we got to be. I think the evidence is so clear. We got to be this animal long before the Holocene, long before there are historical records of anything.
Professor Kristen Hawkes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening this episode till the very end. If you enjoyed it, consider thinking of a friend who might like it too. You can share it with them either directly or bring it up when you next meet them, just mentioning that you heard something they might enjoy. And if you haven't done so yet, please do consider subscribing to the Oninas podcast on your favorite podcast app. This way you will also be notified of my 2 upcoming anthropology episodes, focusing one on romantic love and the other on the origins of war. Thank you as always for listening. Until next time, take care.